The rain fell in a slow, steady drizzle over the forgotten cemetery, turning the soil thick and black. Margot pulled her jacket tight, eyes narrowing as she scanned the rows of crumbling headstones. They were older than she'd imagined, jagged, misshapen stones leaning like they might topple from the weight of all they kept hidden. Her best friend Dan wasn't helping either. "I told you this place would be freaky at night," he said, casting a glance at a moss-covered angel statue missing one eye. "Are you getting cold feet, Dan?" Margot taunted, her voice echoing around the empty graveyard. She wouldn't admit it, but the place was giving her the creeps. Yet that was the whole point. She'd come looking for a scare. Dan shook his head, brushing his damp hair back. "You know me better than that. I don't know. Something about this place feels wrong." As they wandered deeper, their flashlights flickered over the names of the dead. Many of the stones bore dates from over a century ago, and Margot thought of all those bodies lying just beneath her feet, rotting into nothingness. She shivered. They stopped in front of an old family plot, marked by a wrought iron gate hanging open. Inside, 6 stones lay in a perfect row, all bearing the same last name, Thorne. Margot read the names out loud, voice quiet. Francis Thorne, 1834 to 1897. Mary Thorne, 1840 to 1889. And here's their son, Philip, just 16. And another Mary? "It was common to name children after parents," Dan replied, looking over her shoulder. "There's something about that first Mary, though. Look at the date." Margot checked again and frowned. Mary Thorne, 1840 to 1889. Underneath, someone had crudely carved another date, 1892. "That's 3 years later," she murmured. "Why would someone add that?" Dan turned his flashlight around. Maybe she was moved? No, it doesn't make sense. And look, she pointed at the fresh flowers scattered around the stone, white lilies now drenched and wilting in the rain. Who leaves fresh flowers in a place like this? Maybe someone local. "This is a town, after all," Dan replied, sounding like he was trying to convince himself. "But I can't imagine why they'd come out here every week, let alone on a night like this." Then they heard it, a faint whisper coming from somewhere in the dark. Margot felt her heart leap into her throat. "Did you hear that?" Dan's face was pale, but he nodded. "Sounded like someone talking." He swung his flashlight in the direction of the noise, illuminating nothing but mist and broken tombstones. The whisper continued, rising and falling almost like a chant. They looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between them. They'd come this far. No way they were leaving now. Margot took the lead, her steps slow and deliberate. She followed the sound, weaving between graves, their headstones leaning in like they wanted to pull her closer. Dan followed just behind, his breathing loud in the stillness. The whisper grew louder as they approached an old stone chapel at the far edge of the cemetery. The building was no more than a ruin, its roof half collapsed and walls covered in ivy. The whisper now sounded like multiple voices, murmuring in unison. "Who would be here at this hour?" Dan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's just the wind." But Margot didn't believe that, and she could tell by Dan's face that he didn't either. The moment they stepped into the shadow of the chapel, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Margot swallowed hard. "Hello?" Her voice came out shaky, and she immediately regretted saying anything at all. No one answered. They exchanged glances, fear clawing its way into Margot's chest. But before she could suggest they leave, Dan shined his flashlight inside the chapel, and both of them froze. A woman stood in the corner, partially hidden by shadows. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, soaked through from the rain, and her hair clung to her face in dark, dripping strands. Her eyes were wide, staring directly at them. Margot's blood ran cold. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She simply tilted her head, watching them with an intensity that made Margot want to run. The only thing keeping her there was the nagging thought that this woman needed help, that she'd somehow gotten lost. "Ma'am?" Dan asked, stepping closer. "Can we help you?" The woman's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then she lifted her arm, pointing a bony finger at something behind them. Margot turned, and her heart nearly stopped. In the graveyard, shadows were moving between the stones. Figures, just barely visible in the mist, gliding toward them in slow, deliberate steps. "Dan," she whispered. "We need to go." But Dan seemed transfixed by the woman, his eyes wide. He looked back at Margot, his face pale and rigid. I can't move." Margot grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "Dan, snap out of it. We're leaving. Now." At her touch, Dan blinked, as if waking from a trance. Yeah, let's go. But as they turned to leave, the woman in the chapel spoke in a soft, rasping voice. You don't belong here. The words seemed to hang in the air, chilling Margot to the bone. Why? She managed to ask, though every fiber in her body screamed at her to run. The woman's lips curled into a thin, twisted smile. Because you're still alive. A shiver raced down Margot's spine. The shadows from the graveyard were closing in, their hollow eyes glinting in the faint light. They moved with an unnatural grace, hovering just above the ground, their faces blank and featureless. Margot took a step back, pulling Dan with her. Come on, we're getting out of here. They turned and bolted, running back through the graveyard as fast as their legs would carry them. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the ground into a slick mess of mud and roots. But they didn't stop, didn't dare look back until they'd cleared the iron gates. Only then did Margot risk a glance behind her. The cemetery lay quiet and still, as if nothing had happened at all. Dan was panting, clutching his side. Did you see that? Margot nodded, still trying to catch her breath. What were those things? Dan shook his head, eyes wide with fear. I don't know, but I think they wanted us to stay. They didn't speak another word as they left the cemetery, each of them haunted by the image of those blank, lifeless faces, and the woman in white who still stood in the chapel watching them go. As they reached the safety of the car, Margot looked back one last time, her breath fogging the window. Through the mist and rain, she could just make out the faint shape of the woman, standing on the hill by the chapel, watching with those cold, hollow eyes. And then she whispered something that chilled Margot to the core, a promise that echoed in her mind long after they'd driven away. Next time, you won't leave. The old road wound through thick, gnarled woods, where branches arched over it like twisted claws. Nora didn't know why she'd taken it. It was her first time in town, her GPS had cut out, and this road was supposed to be a shortcut according to the rusty sign she'd passed miles back. Now, though, she was beginning to regret it. The trees seemed to lean in closer with every passing mile, their shadows crawling over her car. It was dusk, and the headlights barely made a dent in the gathering darkness. She was debating turning around when she saw something, a figure standing right on the edge of the road. Nora squinted, slowing down to a crawl. It was a man, thin and tall, wearing an old suit that looked as though it had once been black, but had faded into a grimy shade of gray. His face was pale, the eyes deep and sunken, staring unblinkingly at her car. Her instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but she felt drawn to him, compelled by an unseen force to stop. She rolled down her window a crack. Do you need help? She called, her voice sounding small against the oppressive silence of the woods. The man didn't answer, just tilted his head in a way that felt unnatural, as though he was listening to something only he could hear. Then he took a step toward her car, and that was enough to snap her out of her trance. She hit the gas, speeding away, watching him in her rearview mirror until the darkness swallowed him. Her heart raced as she drove, but her relief was short-lived. About a mile down the road, her headlights caught something ahead. It was the man. He was standing there again, still as a statue, looking directly at her with those hollow eyes. This time his face twisted into something almost like a smile, though his mouth was tight and stretched too wide. A chill ran down her spine. There was no way he could have gotten there before her. She'd been going 60. Nora swerved to avoid him, her tires screeching on the cracked alt, and sped past, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel him watching her, even as she left him in the dust. She didn't dare look back again. She was nearly shaking by the time she rounded another bend, the road twisting deeper into the forest. She just needed to keep driving and find a way out. And then her car began to slow. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She slammed her foot down on the gas, but it felt like the car was resisting, as if something were holding it back. The speedometer dipped lower and lower until the car rolled to a complete stop, dead in the middle of the road. She tried the ignition, but it wouldn't turn over. The car was silent, lifeless. Desperation clawed at her as she fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal, not even a flicker of hope. She tried starting the car again, but the silence in response felt almost intentional, as though the car itself were afraid. Then she heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across gravel. It was coming from behind her car. Nora froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She didn't want to look. She couldn't. But the scraping grew louder, closer, and she felt an overwhelming sense that she was being watched. Slowly, she turned her head, just enough to see through the side mirror. Her stomach dropped. There, in the darkness, was the man, his face inches from the rear window, his eyes locked onto hers through the mirror. His mouth was moving, lips curling into words she couldn't hear, but his eyes were filled with something dark, something that felt older than the trees, older than the road itself. Her breath hitched, and she clutched the door handle, feeling her body tense, ready to bolt. But before she could move, the man's face contorted, his mouth opening in a silent scream, his eyes rolling back into his skull. And then he was gone. Nora blinked, shaking, unsure if she'd imagined it. She gripped the wheel, breathing in shallow gasps, and then, without warning, the car roared to life. She didn't wait for an explanation. She pressed the gas, her hands white-knuckling the wheel as the car shot forward, tearing down the road. She didn't care where she was going as long as it was far away from that place. From him. The road eventually gave way to town lights in the distance, and the oppressive feeling of the forest began to lift. Her breathing evened out, and her mind began to clear. She was safe, out of the woods, away from that man. But just as she turned onto the main road, she caught a glimpse of something in her rearview mirror. A dark shape was sitting in the back seat, just behind her, barely visible in the shadows. Nora's heart slammed against her ribcage as she looked in the mirror again, and this time she saw his face. His eyes met hers through the reflection, his mouth curling into that same wide smile. "You shouldn't have left the road," he whispered. The car's lights flickered and the radio crackled to life, filling the car with static and dissonant, whispering voices. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body felt paralyzed, locked in his gaze, trapped in that chilling, suffocating presence. As the car sped down the empty road, her last thought was of that faded, rusty sign she'd passed, its warning scrawled in chipped red letters. "Stay off Old Hollow Road after dark." No one ever saw Nora's car again. But drivers passing through that stretch of woods at night swear they sometimes see her headlights on Old Hollow Road, glowing faintly in the darkness, followed by a thin, pale figure standing beside her car, smiling into the shadows. The night was thick with fog as Jay and Lila pulled up to the decrepit house, its dark silhouette barely visible against the clouded sky. They'd heard about the dead man's manor from the locals in town who warned them never to enter after dark, but Jay, the eternal thrill-seeker, had laughed it off. "Come on, Lila," he'd said with a mischievous grin. "It's just an old, abandoned house. People say it's haunted to scare kids away. Let's go see if there's anything to actually be afraid of." Now, standing before the house, Lila wasn't so sure. The air felt too still, too heavy, as if it were waiting for something to happen. "Jay, I don't know," she whispered, her voice swallowed up by the silence. "Don't wimp out on me now," he replied, pulling out his flashlight and stepping toward the front door, which hung slightly ajar. "You said you wanted an adventure, right?" Lila sighed, reluctantly following him inside. The air was damp and smelled of mold and decay. Their footsteps echoed as they walked through the foyer, where peeling wallpaper and broken furniture lay in ruin. "What happened here?" Lila muttered, casting her flashlight around. "Supposedly, this place belonged to a guy named Elias Crowley," Jay said. "They say he went mad, thought he was hearing voices that told him to do terrible things." Lila shivered. "Like what?" Jay shrugged. "The story goes he vanished without a trace. No one ever found him, but some people claim he never actually left." They moved deeper into the house, passing a grand staircase covered in dust and spider webs. Every so often, Lila felt a chill brush her skin, as if someone were standing right behind her. But whenever she turned, there was nothing but shadows. Jay's flashlight flickered, and he smacked it, muttering, "Cheap piece of junk. Let's head upstairs. Maybe there's something interesting up there." Lila hesitated, but Jay was already climbing, and she didn't want to be left alone. The creaky stairs groaned beneath their weight, echoing through the empty house. The second floor was a long hallway lined with doors, each one leading into dark rooms that smelled like mildew and dust. They peeked into the first room on the left, an old bedroom. The bed was covered in a moth-eaten quilt, and a cracked mirror hung on the opposite wall. As they turned to leave, Lila caught a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. "Jay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What?" he asked, glancing back. I I thought I saw someone, right there in the mirror." Jay laughed, though it sounded forced. "Lila, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Come on, let's check the next room." They moved down the hall, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Each room was worse than the last, filled with tattered furniture and the faint, lingering scent of something rotting. In one room, they found a large, dark stain on the floorboards, as if someone had spilled gallons of ink, or something far worse. Jay knelt down, examining the stain. "This looks like dried blood," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Lila swallowed, taking a step back. "Jay, I don't like this. I really think we should go." But Jay was already moving toward the last room at the end of the hall. As he pushed the door open, the air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over Lila. Inside, the walls were covered in crude, dark symbols, smeared in what looked like dried blood. On the floor, a circle had been drawn with strange markings that seemed to twist and writhe when she looked at them too long. Candles, now burnt down to stubs, were scattered around it. "Jay, let's get out of here," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. But Jay was transfixed, staring at the symbols with wide eyes. "Look at these markings, Lila," he murmured. They're like the ones I saw online about spirit summoning." Lila's heart raced. "I don't care what they are. I want to leave. Please, Jay." Jay turned to her, a strange gleam in his eye. "Just give me a second. I want to see if—" He stepped into the circle, tracing his hand along the strange symbols. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the room, blowing out the last of their candlelight. The darkness was thick and absolute, swallowing their flashlights and plunging them into an oppressive silence. Then a voice, soft and raspy as though coming from just inches away, broke the silence. "Who dares disturb my rest?" Lila's breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room plummeted. She couldn't see Jay, but she could feel his terror in the silence between them. "Who's there?" Jay stammered, his voice shaky. The voice didn't answer. Instead, something cold brushed Lila's cheek, making her flinch. The sensation lingered, and she realized, with a growing sense of horror, that it felt like fingers. Long, icy fingers tracing her face. "Jay!" she gasped, reaching for him, but her hand met empty air. "Jay, where are you?" She whispered, but there was no answer. A faint glow appeared on the far side of the room, illuminating the shadows. In the dim light, she could just make out a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, thin and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide. Elias. Lila's voice shook as she recognized the figure from the faded portraits she'd seen in town. Elias Crowley. The figure's grin grew wider, his eyes locking onto her with a terrifying intensity. "You've come to take my place, haven't you?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in her mind, filling every corner of her thoughts. Lila tried to scream, but no sound came out. She stumbled backward, only to feel a pair of cold hands grip her shoulders from behind. She whipped around, but there was no one there. She could hear Jay now, breathing heavily in the dark, his voice panicked. "Lila, where are you? I can't see you." "Jay," she cried, reaching out blindly, but her hand passed through empty air. His breathing grew fainter, as though he were being pulled away, deeper into the darkness. "Don't leave," Elias's voice hissed beside her ear. "I've waited so long for company." The room seemed to spin, shadows closing in, pressing against her from every side. She felt herself sinking, the darkness swallowing her whole, as if the very walls were alive, reaching for her. In a final, desperate effort, she screamed, "Jay!" But her voice was lost, muffled as the darkness smothered her. When the townspeople found their abandoned car the next morning, no one knew where they'd gone. But locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear faint whispers drifting out from Dead Man's Manor, and if you listen closely, you might even hear the echoes of a woman's voice calling for someone named Jay. And if you're especially unlucky, you might see the faintest glow of hollow eyes watching you from the darkness, waiting for someone to finally take his place. The rain pelted down in a relentless sheet as Sarah turned her car down the dark, winding road. The weather had taken a nasty turn during her drive back from her parents' house, and she'd been forced to take a detour through an unfamiliar part of town. Tall trees loomed on either side of the narrow road, casting eerie shadows that danced in her headlights. She squinted, struggling to see through the rain-soaked windshield. Then, out of nowhere, she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, drenched from head to toe. Sarah slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick asphalt. Her heart pounded as the car came to a stop just a few feet from the person, who stood motionless in the beams of her headlights. The figure was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned white nightgown that clung to her body, soaked and tattered at the edges. Her long, dark hair hung in wet strands, covering her face. She didn't move, didn't react, just stood there as the rain poured down. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The woman didn't look like someone out for an evening walk. There was something about her that felt wrong. Sarah rolled down her window a crack, letting in the sound of the rain hammering on the roof. Are you all right?" she called out, her voice wavering. The woman slowly turned her head toward Sarah, revealing a pale, gaunt face, her eyes hollow and dark. For a long, chilling moment, she just stared, unblinking, her gaze empty and unreadable. Then, in a voice that barely rose above the rain, she whispered, "Please, help me." Sarah hesitated, every instinct in her screaming to drive away. But there was something desperate in the woman's voice, something that pulled at her sense of compassion. "Do you need a ride?" Sarah asked, trying to steady her voice. The woman nodded, her movements stiff and unnatural. Against her better judgment, Sarah reached over and unlocked the passenger door. The woman climbed in without a word, bringing the cold, wet scent of rain and earth with her. Sarah shivered as the woman settled into the seat, her hands resting limply in her lap. Where do you need to go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman turned to her, her dark eyes fixing on Sarah's face. "Just keep driving. I'll tell you when to stop." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard, and eased the car back onto the road. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the sound of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. She glanced at the woman out of the corner of her eye, feeling a strange sense of unease. Her skin was unnaturally pale, her lips tinged blue, and her hands were ice cold against her own. As they drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning through the dark woods. Time seemed to slip away, and Sarah felt a growing sense of dread, as if they were moving deeper into a place where no one else had been in a very, very long time. Are we almost there?" she ventured after what felt like hours. The woman turned to her, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of emotion in those hollow eyes. Something dark, something almost like sadness, or maybe fear. "Not yet," the woman whispered. "Just a little farther." Sarah forced herself to keep her gaze on the road, though every instinct screamed at her to look at the woman, to really look at her. But fear held her in place, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The rain had started to let up when the woman finally spoke again, her voice a soft, chilling whisper. "Turn here," she said, pointing to a narrow, overgrown path that led into the woods. Sarah hesitated, her pulse quickening. Are you sure? This doesn't look like a road." The woman's gaze sharpened, her voice taking on a strange urgency. "Please, I need to go home." Sarah swallowed, her mouth dry, but something in the woman's tone compelled her to obey. She turned onto the narrow path, the car's headlights cutting through the dense, twisted trees that seemed to close in around them. They drove in silence for a few more minutes before the woman spoke again. "Stop," she whispered. Sarah hit the brakes, and the car came to a halt in front of a small, abandoned house barely visible in the darkness. The place was in ruins, its windows broken and walls sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Ivy and moss crept up the sides, giving it an eerie, otherworldly look. Is this your home?" Sarah asked, glancing at the woman in disbelief. The woman didn't answer. She simply opened the door, stepping out into the mud and rain, her bare feet sinking into the wet earth. She stood there, staring at the house, a look of profound sadness on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, though Sarah wasn't sure if she was even talking to her. A sudden, fierce chill swept through the car, and Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. When she looked up again, the woman was gone, vanished into the darkness. Only the abandoned house loomed before her, silent and foreboding. A strange sense of dread washed over her, and she felt a compulsion to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. She shifted into reverse, but before she could back away, something caught her eye. In the rearview mirror, she saw the woman again, standing just behind the car, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light. You left me here," the woman said, her voice low and accusing. You left me, just like everyone else. Sarah's heart pounded as the woman stepped closer, her face inches from the glass. Her eyes were filled with an otherworldly sadness, and tears, cold, inhuman tears, slid down her hollow cheeks. No, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I didn't. But the woman's face twisted, her sadness shifting into something dark, something filled with fury. You all left me, she hissed, her voice echoing with a dozen other voices, hollow and full of pain. You left me here to rot, to be forgotten. The woman's hands pressed against the glass, her fingers elongating, twisting unnaturally as they clawed their way down the window, leaving streaks of muddy water that seemed to bleed into the glass. Sarah screamed, throwing the car into gear and slamming her foot on the gas. She sped down the narrow road, heart racing, her mind consumed by fear. But even as she drove, she could still see the woman's face in her mirror, watching her with those hollow, accusing eyes, her voice echoing in Sarah's mind. You'll come back, the woman whispered, her voice chilling. You'll come back because I'm not done with you. Sarah didn't stop driving until she reached the safety of town, her hands shaking, her mind racing. But as she stumbled out of the car, breathless and terrified, she realized that a damp, cold handprint was smeared across her windshield. And every time she looked in her mirror afterward, she swore she could see a figure standing just behind her, waiting in the shadows with those hollow, haunting eyes, waiting to drag her back to that dark, lonely place in the woods. The cabin looked innocent enough when Logan and Mia found it, nestled deep in the woods, far off the beaten path. They'd been hiking since noon, eager for a weekend away from their phones and city noise. Their friend Dave, who joined them, said it was just what they all needed. A few days in nature, no distractions. The sun was setting when they stumbled across it. An old wooden cabin, weathered and covered in moss, its windows dark and foreboding. Perfect place to stop for the night, Dave said with a grin, running a hand along the doorframe. It's probably been abandoned for years. We might as well make use of it, right? Mia hesitated, a shiver running down her spine. I don't know. Something feels off about this place. Oh, come on, Logan said, pulling her in closer. What's the worst that could happen? It's just an old cabin. Reluctantly, she agreed, and the three of them stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot. Dust coated every surface, and thick cobwebs stretched across the corners of the ceiling. After setting up their sleeping bags, they built a small fire in the fireplace, and soon the cabin felt a bit more inviting. They passed around a bottle of whiskey, laughing and swapping stories until the fire's glow began to dim. Then, as the laughter faded, a strange sound broke the silence. A soft, scratching noise. Faint, but insistent. They all stopped talking, their eyes darting around the dark cabin. Did you hear that? Maya whispered, clutching Logan's arm. Probably just an animal outside, Logan said, though his voice held a tremor. These old places settle at night, right? But the sound continued, this time coming from below, as if something were scratching at the very floor they sat on. Dave grinned, trying to lighten the mood. Ooh, maybe it's the ghost of some old lumberjack, he joked, wiggling his fingers. Mia's laughter died in her throat as she caught a flicker of movement near the edge of the room. She blinked, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the scratching sound grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking against wood. Maybe we should check it out, she said, her voice shaky. Dave and Logan exchanged glances, clearly unsure, but Logan shrugged. Fine, if it'll make us all feel better. They grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound to a small trapdoor near the back of the cabin, hidden beneath a dusty rug. The trapdoor was old, barely held together, and when Logan lifted it, a wave of cold, damp air rushed out, carrying with it a putrid stench that made them all gag. Smells like something died down there, Dave muttered, covering his nose. Maybe a raccoon or something got trapped, Logan said, trying to sound confident. Mia looked down into the darkness, her heart racing. The flashlight barely penetrated the blackness below. The scratching had stopped, but an eerie, heavy silence filled the air, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath. Dave chuckled nervously. Probably nothing. I mean, come on, Suddenly, a faint whisper drifted up from the darkness, so quiet it was almost drowned out by the pounding of their hearts. You shouldn't be here. The three of them froze, their eyes wide, the blood draining from their faces. Logan swallowed, shining the flashlight into the darkness again. Did you hear that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. It's just the wind, Dave said, though he didn't sound convinced. Mia shook her head. No, that was a voice. Someone's down there. Just then, the scratching started again, louder this time, more frantic, and with it came the whisper, more insistent now, as if warning them away. Leave, before it wakes. Logan backed away, pulling Mia with him, his face pale. We should go. This isn't right. But before they could turn, Dave, always the bravest, or maybe the most reckless of the group, lowered himself down into the darkness. Come on, guys, it's just some stupid prank, he muttered, forcing a laugh. I'll prove it. He disappeared into the blackness, the beam of his flashlight dancing wildly across the walls before it vanished. Mia held her breath, waiting, listening, her hand tightly gripping Logan's. Silence. Too much silence. Dave, Logan called, his voice shaking. You okay down there? But there was no answer, only the heavy, suffocating silence, broken by the faint, rhythmic sound of breathing, so faint they almost missed it. Then Dave's voice came, soft, distant. Guys, you need to see this. Logan and Mia exchanged a glance. Maybe we should leave him, Logan whispered, fear clear in his voice. But Mia shook her head, steeling herself. Dave, what do you see? She called, peering down into the darkness. There was a long pause, and then, almost too quiet to hear, he whispered, It's not alone. Before she could react, she heard a strange, wet sound, like something slithering over wood, and Dave's flashlight clattered to the ground. Then came the screaming. It was a horrible guttural sound, filled with pain and terror. It echoed up from the trapdoor, filling the small cabin until it abruptly cut off, leaving them in a horrible, echoing silence. Mia grabbed Logan's hand, her face pale, her body shaking. We have to get out of here, she whispered, pulling him toward the door. But as they turned, they saw him standing there. Dave was at the entrance of the cabin, his face twisted in an unnatural smile, his eyes blank and staring straight ahead. His clothes were torn, smeared with something dark and wet, and his skin had taken on a gray, waxy pallor. Dave? Logan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dave tilted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Logan's. His lips moved, forming words that were barely audible. I told you to leave. And then, with a sickening crack, his neck twisted back, his head hanging at an impossible angle. Something dark and viscous dripped from his mouth as he took a slow, shuffling step forward, his body moving with a strange puppet-like stiffness. Mia screamed, grabbing Logan's hand and yanking him toward the back door. They stumbled out into the night, the rain pouring down as they sprinted through the trees, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, they could still hear Dave's voice, faint and twisted, calling after them in a sing-song tone that echoed through the woods. Come back and stay. It's so lonely here. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. Logan fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open, and they collapsed into the seats, gasping for breath. As they sped down the road, Mia chanced to glance back, and her blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the trees, was the cabin, dark and silent. And standing in the doorway was Dave, his head tilted, his eyes hollow, watching them leave with that same twisted, unnatural smile. For the rest of their lives, neither Mia nor Logan spoke of that night. But whenever they closed their eyes, they could still see Dave's face, still hear his voice, echoing in the dark, always whispering, come back, come back. The night was cold, the forest silent except for the occasional rustling of branches. Emma and her brother Liam were on their annual camping trip with their friend Marcus. This year, they had chosen a remote section of the forest, far from cell reception and even farther from civilization. They found a small clearing and set up their tents, laughing and talking as they roasted marshmallows over the fire. But as the evening wore on, the forest around them seemed to press in closer, the trees looming taller and darker. By midnight, a dense fog had crept over the clearing, muffling their voices and swallowing the fire's light. It's a little creepy out here, Emma murmured, staring into the swirling fog. Don't go scaring yourself, Liam laughed, though his voice had a nervous edge. It's just fog, means we're close to water, probably a river nearby. Marcus threw another log onto the fire, the flames flickering higher. You know, he began, his voice low and dramatic, there's an old story about these woods. Locals say it's haunted. Emma groaned, rolling her eyes. Of course, you would bring this up now. Marcus grinned, enjoying their discomfort. They say a long time ago there was a family that lived here, an old woman and her two sons. No one really knew where they came from, but people said strange things started happening around here when they moved in. Livestock disappearing, missing kids, classic ghost story stuff. Sounds like they just wanted to scare away trespassers, Liam said with a scoff. Marcus leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. One day, a search party found a clearing just like this one, with bits of bone buried in the dirt and strange symbols carved into the trees. When they finally confronted the old woman, she just smiled and said, "They all come back eventually." And then, a sudden crack from the trees made them all jump. The laughter died on Marcus's lips as they stared into the darkness. "Probably an animal," Liam muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. They tried to laugh it off, but the strange, oppressive silence that followed made it hard to relax. The three of them sat closer to the fire, glancing nervously at the trees that loomed just beyond the edge of the clearing. The fog grew thicker, coiling around the trees, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human before dissipating. Then, through the swirling mist, Emma thought she saw movement, a flicker of a shadow just beyond the firelight. "Did you see that?" she whispered, clutching Liam's arm. He nodded, his face pale. "Probably just a deer, or something." But deep down they all felt it, a prickle of fear, an unshakable feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, Marcus gasped, his eyes wide, staring at something behind them. Emma and Liam whipped around, their hearts pounding, but there was nothing there, only darkness and mist. "Did you see something?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Marcus shook his head, swallowing hard. "I don't know. It looked like someone standing there, watching us." They all went silent, listening to the whisper of the wind through the trees. But then the silence deepened, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "Maybe we should just get some sleep," Liam suggested, forcing a smile. "The mind plays tricks in the dark." Reluctantly, they put out the fire and retreated to their tents, zipping themselves into thin layers of nylon that felt pitifully inadequate against the creeping dread that had settled over the clearing. But sleep didn't come. Emma lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, her pulse thudding in her ears. She could hear Liam's breathing beside her and Marcus's occasional rustling from his own tent. Then she heard something else, soft, shuffling footsteps, moving just outside her tent. She held her breath, her heart racing. Maybe it was an animal, a curious raccoon or a fox. But the footsteps were heavy, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. Slowly, she reached over, nudging Liam awake. He opened his eyes, and she put a finger to her lips, motioning for him to listen. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer to the tent. Liam's eyes widened, and he mouthed, "What is that?" Emma shook her head, terror gripping her. The footsteps stopped right outside their tent. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence, and then came the sound of fingernails scraping against the nylon, slow and deliberate. Emma clamped a hand over her mouth, trying to stifle a scream. Liam grabbed a flashlight and, with trembling hands, aimed it at the tent wall. "Who's there?" he called, his voice barely steady. No response, only the scratching, persistent and relentless. "Marcus," Emma whispered desperately. "Do you hear that?" But there was no answer from Marcus's tent. Panic surged through her. She grabbed the zipper, yanking it open just a crack, and peered outside. The fog had thickened, swirling around the tents, but she could just make out Marcus's tent across the clearing. The flap was open, and the tent was empty. A figure moved through the fog, tall and thin, its outline barely visible. It seemed to glide, its movements slow and deliberate. She couldn't see its face, but she felt its gaze, cold and piercing, locking onto her. She pulled back into the tent, her breathing ragged. "Liam, there's someone out there." He didn't hesitate. Grabbing their flashlight and a pocket knife, he whispered, "We're leaving. Now." They scrambled out of the tent, clutching each other as they stumbled toward the edge of the clearing. But as they moved, the fog thickened, blurring their vision, distorting the trees around them. They ran, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves, the mist pressing in on all sides. But no matter how far they went, the clearing seemed to stretch on, the trees looping back on themselves. And then they saw Marcus. He was standing in the middle of the clearing, his back to them. Relief flooded over Emma, and she called out to him, her voice shaky. "Marcus, where were you?" He didn't respond. They moved closer, their footsteps hesitant, but as they approached, they saw something that made them stop cold. His arms hung limply by his sides, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight ahead. And carved into the tree behind him were strange, jagged symbols, dripping with a dark, wet substance. "Marcus?" Liam's voice was barely a whisper. Slowly, Marcus turned, his face expressionless. His lips parted and he spoke in a voice that was not his own, low and raspy, filled with something ancient and terrible. "They all come back eventually." The words hung in the air, cold and final. And then his eyes fixed on them, his gaze empty and hungry. Emma and Liam backed away, their hearts pounding. But as they turned, they saw more figures emerging from the fog, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. Men, women, children, all of them standing silently, watching with empty gazes, their faces twisted in eternal haunting expressions. Panicked, Emma grabbed Liam's hand, pulling him back toward the trees, desperate to escape. But as they stumbled through the fog, the whispers followed, soft and insistent, filling the air around them. "They all come back. They all come back." And as the fog closed in, Emma realized with a cold, sinking dread that they had never left the clearing at all. The trees stretched endlessly, looping back and forth, trapping them in a place outside of time. And in the distance, she could still hear Marcus's voice mingling with the whispers, calling to them in that ancient, hollow tone. "Welcome home." The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place. It was surrounded by thick woods with a few winding roads and a small, forgotten cemetery hidden deep among the trees. Locals avoided it, not out of fear, but because it was simply unpleasant. Stories circulated, of course, but every town has its rumors. The only people who ventured out there were those looking for a thrill or a dare. That's how Alex, Sarah, and found themselves there on Halloween night. They'd heard stories from their classmates about the Watcher in the Woods, a figure who supposedly lingered in the cemetery, watching anyone who dared to come close. The legend went that if you saw the Watcher, you'd go missing within 3 days. "Come on, guys," Ben teased as they stepped out of the car, the forest swallowing them in darkness. "Are we really afraid of some old story?" Sarah shot him a warning look, though she was trying to hide her nerves. "It's creepy out here, Ben. Besides, people have disappeared." "Yeah, and most of them were just runaways," Alex replied, though his own voice was shaky. "We'll check it out, snap a few photos and go. No harm, right?" The cemetery was about a mile into the woods, down a narrow, twisting trail. The night was pitch black, and even with their flashlights, the dense canopy made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Every snap of a twig or rustling of leaves made them jump, their senses on high alert. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached it. The cemetery was small, enclosed by a crumbling stone wall and filled with old, leaning headstones, their inscriptions faded and illegible. An eerie mist clung to the ground, twisting between the stones like fingers reaching out from the grave. Ben gave a nervous laugh. "See? Nothing here but a few broken tombstones. This is..." "Shh," Sarah hissed, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Do you see that?" At the far end of the cemetery, near a large oak tree, a figure was standing. It was tall and thin, with a hood pulled over its head, casting its face in shadow. The figure stood perfectly still, watching them. Alex's blood ran cold. "Is that someone watching us?" "Come on, it's probably just another kid trying to freak us out," Ben whispered, though he sounded uncertain. "Let's go say hi." They took a few steps forward, but as they did, the figure took a step back, disappearing behind the tree. "Okay, maybe we should just go," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. But before they could turn, something strange happened. The figure reappeared, not by the oak, but on the other side of the cemetery, its head tilted, watching them again. It was as though it had glided across the ground without moving. "Let's leave," Alex said, a chill running down his spine. They turned back toward the trail, but the fog had thickened, swallowing the trees and the path. Everything looked the same, no matter which direction they turned. The cemetery had seemed small at first, but now it felt endless, stretching on in every direction. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, clutching Alex's arm. "We just need to calm down," Ben said, though his face was pale. He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. "Let me get a map up and..." He stopped, staring at the screen in horror. The time on his phone was frozen, like locked on 11:57. No service, no signal. The battery was at 0%. "That's impossible," he stammered, showing the others. It was fully charged when we left the car. A low whisper drifted through the air, soft and unintelligible, as if the wind itself were speaking to them. The hairs on the back of Alex's neck stood on end. He strained to hear, and though he couldn't understand the words, he felt the cold weight of them. "Keep moving," Alex muttered. "We just need to keep moving." But as they turned to leave, they froze. The figure was there again, only closer this time, standing at the entrance to the cemetery. Its face was still hidden, but they could see its eyes now, dark, hollow, and fixed on them with an intensity that felt almost physical. Ben grabbed Alex's arm. "Run. Now." They took off into the mist, their flashlights bouncing wildly, illuminating only glimpses of trees and tombstones as they fled. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure was always there, just on the edge of their vision, gliding silently behind them. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees. Alex stopped, reaching out to help her, but as he turned, he saw it again, this time directly in front of them. The figure's face was partially visible under the hood now, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pull them in, locking them in place. Ben screamed, grabbing a rock and hurling it at the figure. But it passed straight through, as if it were made of smoke. "Please," Sarah whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "Let us go." The figure tilted its head, and a soft, raspy voice echoed through the cemetery. "You came to see, and now you cannot leave." They stumbled backward, and the figure's gaze followed, its eyes unblinking, as if it were savoring the fear that radiated from them. The mist swirled around them, thickening, coiling tighter, until they could barely breathe. "Why are you doing this?" Alex shouted, his voice desperate. The figure raised a skeletal hand, pointing to the ground. They looked down, and in the dirt, faint letters began to appear, scratched into the earth by some unseen hand. "We are forgotten. We are left. Now you stay." They felt the air grow colder, heavier, pressing down on them as the mist thickened into a suffocating shroud. The figure drew closer, and they could feel a chilling, otherworldly energy radiating from it, freezing them in place. Ben grabbed Alex's shoulder, his eyes wild with terror. "It's not going to let us leave. It wants us to stay with it." Desperation filled them. Alex turned, dragging Sarah with him as they blindly ran through the mist. This time, they didn't look back, didn't dare slow down, until they burst out of the woods, gasping for breath. They looked around, realizing they were standing on the road, mere feet from where they'd parked the car. The fog had lifted, the night silent and still. But as they turned back, the cemetery was gone. There was only a thick line of trees stretching into darkness. They piled into the car, speeding down the road in silence, the eerie quiet settling over them. When they finally pulled into town, Sarah broke the silence. Did we really see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No one answered. But as they drove past the "Welcome to Willow Creek" sign, Alex glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the figure, watching them with those hollow, hungry eyes. They never spoke of that night again, but each of them noticed strange things afterward. Lights flickering at odd hours, shadows that moved just beyond their vision. And on the third night after their visit to the cemetery, Ben disappeared, leaving only a note with a single sentence, "They all come back eventually." The storm raged on as Claire steered her car down the winding country road, her headlights barely cutting through the sheets of rain pouring from the dark sky. She was miles from home, having taken a detour through the remote countryside to avoid a major accident on the highway. Her GPS had given up, and the radio was dead. The only sound was the relentless drum of rain on her windshield and the groaning wind that seemed to shake the car. Just as she began to feel truly lost, Claire saw a flickering sign up ahead, faintly illuminated against the darkness, Red Pines Motel. She sighed in relief, thinking she could wait out the storm, get some rest, and find her way back in the morning. As she pulled into the gravel lot, she noticed the motel was in disrepair. The paint was peeling, the windows were dusty, and the vacancy sign buzzed weakly. But Claire was too tired and soaked to care. She grabbed her bag, bracing herself against the icy rain, and made her way to the office door. Inside, the room was dim, smelling faintly of mildew. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face hidden by shadows. He looked up with a slow smile as Claire approached. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yes, please," she replied, trying not to shiver. The man slid a key across the counter without asking for any payment. which struck her as strange, but she didn't press him. He simply pointed toward the farthest building at the edge of the lot. Room 12. Don't stray too far from your room tonight. Claire nodded, pocketing the key as she headed toward the door. Before she left, she glanced back. The old man's eyes seemed to follow her, unblinking, but she quickly brushed off the feeling as the chill of the storm hit her once more. Room 12 was down a narrow, overgrown path. The rain had finally begun to let up as she reached the door and unlocked it, stepping inside and flicking on the light. The room was basic, with old floral wallpaper, a single bed, and a small round mirror on the far wall. A faint, musty smell clung to the air, but at least it was dry. Exhausted, she sank onto the bed, letting her head fall back. She was about to drift off when she heard the first creak. It came from just outside her door, a slow, steady creak, like a footstep on an old, rotting board. She froze, listening as the sound continued, moving closer. Claire sat up, heart pounding, and glanced at the window, but all she could see was darkness. She moved quietly to the door, pressing her ear against it, but as soon as she did, the creaking stopped. "Hello?" she called softly, hoping it was just the wind. Silence. Then a soft scratching right on the other side of the door. Every nerve in her body went tense. She stepped back, watching the doorknob in dread. A shuffling sound, like something being dragged, echoed through the hallway outside. The air grew thick, heavy, as if something was pressing against the walls of the room. She backed up slowly, her hand reaching for her phone, only to find that it was dead. Claire cursed under her breath, panic beginning to rise. She thought of going back to the front office, but she'd have to open the door, and whatever was outside didn't feel like a friendly stranger. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, thick and unnatural. She was just beginning to calm herself when she heard a soft voice. It sounded almost like humming. The tune was light, almost melodic, like an old lullaby, and it was coming from the corner of the room. Claire's heart lurched as she turned toward the sound. Her eyes darted to the small mirror, and there, reflected in its dusty surface, was the faint outline of a woman. The figure wore a long, tattered dress and had stringy, wet hair that clung to her face, which was turned away, humming softly to herself. She appeared to be hovering just above the floor, her feet barely grazing the ground. Claire's body went numb with terror as the humming grew louder. The woman's head slowly tilted, her face turning toward the mirror. And as she did, her eyes met Claire's through the reflection. They were hollow, black pits, deep and endless. "Who are you?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stopped humming. A silence fell over the room, so complete it felt like it might swallow her whole. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, like the faint rustling of dead leaves, the woman spoke. "I've been waiting so long." Claire's breath hitched as the woman began to move, drifting toward the mirror. Her eyes locked onto Claire's, her face twisted in a mixture of longing and rage. "Please, Claire whispered, backing away, but her words were swallowed by the room, which had grown unbearably cold. The woman reached the mirror, pressing a hand against it, her pale fingers long and skeletal. For a moment, Claire thought she was safe behind the glass. But then the woman's hand began to push through, as if the surface of the mirror were liquid. Claire stumbled backward, her eyes wide with horror as the woman's hand emerged, groping toward her with a desperate clawing motion. "Stay with me," the woman rasped, her voice filled with a deep, aching sorrow. "Don't leave me alone." Claire grabbed the door handle, twisting it desperately, and bolted into the hallway, running toward the office. She threw herself against the counter, her breathing ragged. The old man was gone. The office was empty, dust settling on the worn furniture as if no one had been there for years. She turned to flee, but there was something wrong with the door. Something wasn't letting her open it. And then she heard it, the humming. It was behind her, closer than before. Slowly she turned, feeling an unbearable cold seep into her bones. The woman was there, standing just a few feet away, her eyes locked onto Claire's, filled with a longing that was both sorrowful and furious. "I waited," the woman whispered, her voice echoing through the empty office. "All these years, and no one came back. You can't leave. Not now. Not ever." Claire backed away, feeling the walls close in, her body growing cold as the woman reached out, her fingers brushing Claire's arm. A flash of memories hit her, images of others before her, people who had stumbled into this place and never left. Faces twisted in terror, screams lost in the silence of the motel. All of them, waiting. And then the woman's face changed, becoming younger, frightened, trapped. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a mere breath. With a sudden surge of energy, Claire broke free, bursting through the door into the rain, which had started up again, fierce and unrelenting. She ran to her car, her fingers fumbling with the keys, and managed to start the engine, speeding away from the motel as fast as she could. When she finally reached a gas station hours later, she stumbled inside, her hands shaking. She explained what she'd seen to the attendant, who listened with a pale, grim expression. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "That motel burned down 20 years ago. People say the souls of those who died in the fire are still there, waiting for someone to set them free." Claire felt a chill run down her spine as she turned back toward the road, realizing that the fog in her rearview mirror hadn't lifted. And somewhere deep within it, a faint humming drifted on the wind, beckoning her back. The last train left the platform at 11:53 p.m., and Eliza found herself alone in the deserted station, watching the clock tick towards midnight. She had missed her train, and the next one wouldn't arrive until morning. The station was empty except for a single broken vending machine in the corner, humming and flickering. The night was dead silent except for the occasional hollow echo of dripping water somewhere down the platform. She sighed, wrapping her coat tighter around herself, and settled on a metal bench, deciding she'd try to wait it out. Minutes passed in silence. Then, faintly, she heard footsteps. She looked down the platform, expecting to see someone else stranded, but there was nothing, only the dim lights stretching into the darkness. The sound was distant but distinct, a soft shuffle like someone dragging their feet. Feeling uneasy, she checked her watch. 12:03 a.m. When she looked up again, her heart skipped. There was a figure, far down the platform, standing just beyond the light's reach. It was barely visible, but she could make out its outline. A tall, shadowy form that seemed to sway slightly in place. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing down the platform. No answer. The figure remained still. She stood up, trying to convince herself that maybe it was just someone else waiting for a late-night train. But something was wrong. The figure's silhouette was too dark, too solid, almost as though it absorbed the light around it. It began moving slowly toward her, its steps deliberate, dragging. As it came closer, she could make out a face, pale and lifeless, with eyes that seemed hollow like black pits. The figure wore what looked like an old train conductor's uniform, covered in dark stains. Eliza took a step back, her throat tight with fear. Are you okay?" Again, no response. The figure stopped just short of the light, its head tilting slightly, its gaze fixed on her. She took another step back, clutching her bag. "I'm just waiting for the next train, okay? I'll be gone by morning." The figure seemed to smile then, a slow, unsettling grin that didn't reach its empty eyes. "The last train," it said in a raspy voice, barely above a whisper, "is always on time." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she felt an instinctive urge to run. But as she turned to flee, she saw another figure on the opposite end of the platform, dressed in the same dark, stained conductor's uniform, watching her with that same hollow gaze. Heart pounding, she glanced around, looking for any way out. But both ends of the platform were blocked by those eerie, identical figures, each inching closer, their steps slow and deliberate, trapping her. "Eliza," one of them rasped, and she froze. How do you know my name?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure's grin widened, and it pointed down the tracks, where another sound began to emerge, a low, distant rumbling like an oncoming train. The sound grew louder, the vibration of the tracks filling the air. But something was wrong with the sound. It was hollow, distant, as though it were echoing from deep underground. And when the train finally appeared, it was not like any train she'd ever seen. It was dark, ancient-looking, with windows blacked out and rusted metal sides that seemed to pulsate with an eerie, faint glow. The train slowed as it approached the platform, stopping with a groaning creak that echoed through the station. The doors opened with a loud metallic screech, and a chilling cold poured out, filling the station with an icy fog. Eliza stumbled backward, her legs shaking. She could hear faint voices coming from inside the train, whispers, cries, laughter, all blending into a haunting chorus that sent chills through her body. One of the figures stepped forward, gesturing toward the open doors. "Your train has arrived." Eliza shook her head, backing away, but the other figure was already behind her, blocking her escape. She could feel the chill from the open train doors pulling her in, the whispers growing louder, wrapping around her, filling her mind with a sense of dread that she couldn't escape. No. Please, no, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. But the figures were relentless, guiding her toward the train. And as she reached the threshold, she felt something icy latch onto her wrist, tugging her inside. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the freezing cold. Inside the train, the seats were filled with shadowy figures, each one staring blankly ahead, eyes hollow, faces frozen in expressions of terror or sorrow. She could feel their empty stares on her as she stumbled down the aisle, her feet moving against her will. The doors shut with a final, resounding clang, and the train began to move, picking up speed as it plunged into a tunnel that seemed to stretch forever. She looked out the window, but all she could see was darkness. Endless, suffocating darkness. Desperately, she tried to pull her hand away from the icy grip holding her, but it only tightened, cold seeping into her bones. She looked around, her heart racing, and realized that the other passengers were all staring at her now, their hollow eyes fixed, their mouths moving soundlessly, as though they were trying to tell her something. And then she understood. These were the souls of those who had boarded the midnight train, the ones who had gone missing, lost forever, bound to ride the endless tracks. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Let me go. But the figures only watched, their expressions shifting from sorrow to pity, as if they too knew there was no escape. The lights inside the train began to flicker, dimming to a sickly green glow. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears, her mind, until they became a roar, a deafening cacophony of lost voices, each one crying out, each one trapped. As the train barreled through the darkness, Eliza felt herself slipping away, her consciousness fading, merging with the whispers, becoming one with the endless, haunted chorus. And as the train disappeared into the night, the empty platform remained silent once more, waiting patiently for the next lost soul to board the midnight train, bound for nowhere.